much, John. And thanks to our host here at Cato, Dave Bose, who was a little bit surprised when he learned that Ralph Nader had written a foreword to this book. My credentials suddenly crumbled, but that's all right. And afterward was written by Bill Redpath, who is chair of the Libertarian National Committee, so I'm sandwiched between the two extremes of the political spectrum, and I think it's a great thing. Something's got to be seriously wrong, folks, when you've got Ralph Nader praising my work on the one hand and Bill Redpath on the other. As John mentioned, I'm a professor of economics at George Mason, and we pride ourselves on our specialty in the field of what's called public choice. This is the economics of politics. And I came to this issue because of the fact that I began to notice that candidates other than Democrats and Republicans, despite the excitement that they started with, soon faded in the political arena and were not really considered seriously by the time the elections arose. And I began to wonder what was going on. And as an academic, of course, one of the first things you do is you say, well, what else has been done in this field? And I found very little has been done by the political science fraternity, or the political science academics. And apparently, to political sciences, the domination of politics by the Demopublicans, what I call the Democrats and the Republicans, you may recall that, or at least I do, I'm old enough, and that's why I'm using notes, that George Wallace, in his campaign in 1968, pointed out that there's not a dime's worth of Democrats between the Republicans and the Democrats, and so that's why I call them the Demopublicans. And it's, to the political science community, apparently, having the Demopublicans dominate the field is not only how things are, but also how they should be, and I take exception to that. And it seems many voters also have apparently come to the conclusion that voting for candidates outside the Demopublicans is somehow suspect, if not unpatriotic or even subversive. So we need new approaches to problems. We need more issues put before the American voters. We need to widen the range of political debate, and that's what these third parties and so on have done. Third parties have traditionally challenged the status quo, and they have led to change and new ideas and so on. And throughout our nation's history, particularly before the Civil War, we had really dozens of different parties. Some interesting names, just to throw them out quickly: the Mugwumps, the Anti-Masons, the Know-Nothings, Bull Moose, and of course more recently the Conservative Party, the Libertarians, the Greens, the Reform Party, and so on and so forth. Many of these parties had good ideas. The Liberty Party, for example, was abolitionist and opposed slavery. Some of them have ideas that aren't so good. For example, we had the Prohibition Party, and you can imagine what their agenda was. So early in the nation's history, we had many parties, rough and tumble politics, and, by the way, a very high rate of turnout in elections. What happened to change all of this? Elections and virtually all political discourse is now dominated by the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, being a libertarian, one of the first things I do is to go to that document that a lot of people don't put a lot of credence in today, which is the Constitution of the United States, and ask, what does it say about political parties? And the answer is nothing. However, in the debate about the Constitution, Federalist Papers and our patriots such as James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and so on, a great deal was said about the notion of faction. Faction, in today's terminology, is special interest, and political parties were considered to be special interest who wanted to use the power of the state to benefit themselves and their members. Even today, surveys have shown throughout the world deep public distrust of political parties everywhere. In polling, political parties are ranked in public esteem lower than lawyers. Yes, lower than lawyers. That tells you something. Nevertheless, we have political parties, and by the end of the Civil War, the Dems and the Republicans were entrenched as the two major political parties, a duopoly controlling politics. How did this occur? There's a number of reasons, and I will talk about four. First was the elimination of multi-member districts. At-large elections were sharply restricted by the Apportionment Act of 1842 that required congressmen to be elected in single-member districts so that candidates winning the most votes is the sole representative. French sociologist Maurice Duverger showed that the simple majority single ballot system strongly favors two parties. This is a phenomenon known as Duverger's law. Voting for a long-shot candidate who might prevail as third or fourth choice in a multi-member election is widely viewed today as throwing away one's vote in a winner-take-all system. So it discourages single-member districts, discourages voting for third parties and independent candidates. And incidentally, I might add, the Electoral College's winner-take-all practice also encourages the two-party system. Politically, however, single-member districts make some sense in today's world. You can think of, for example, the concern of people in upstate New York about being dominated by the people in Manhattan and so on and so forth. Now, the second, and in my view the most important impediment to third parties, is the so-called government reform. You know, when libertarians hear that government is being reformed by politicians, we always grab our wallets. And the idea of the Australian ballot is that the government will print and provide the ballots. Prior to the 1890s, ballots were privately printed by the parties themselves so that any party could print up a ballot with any slate of candidates that they wanted. But in the 1890s, in response to a lot of corruption that occurred in the 1888 elections, governments began to supply a single consolidated ballot for all candidates for all offices. This was the Australian ballot. And by 1910, only 2 states did not use the Australian ballot. By the way, one of those, South Carolina, permitted the use of private ballots up until about 1950. Control of the ballot by government allowed government to control who gets on the ballot. And a major justification for the Australian ballot is that non-serious candidates can be excluded. As those patronizing, condescending elites who know what is best for the rest of us are well aware, too many choices confuse the voters. So we have to, look after the voters to avoid confusion there. The major parties never had never did and still don't have a problem getting their candidates on the ballot because access is based on the number of votes received in the previous election. But candidates and parties outside the duopoly have serious impediments due to ballot access laws. Some states require tens of thousands of valid signatures on petitions just to appear on the state ballot. In Oklahoma, in 2008, for example, more than 40,000 signatures were required just to appear on the ballot. And the emphasis here is on the word valid. The slightest discrepancy can have not only a name thrown out, but a whole page of petitions. For example, John introduced me as Jim Bennett, and if I put down my name as James T. Bennett in my address and then signed it Jim Bennett, that would be considered, a bad and an invalid petition signing. Failing to dot an I, failing to cross a T, all these kinds of things can invalidate whole pages. So the real issue is you probably need 10 or 20% more than the minimum in order to be assured to get on the ballot. And the Democrats and the Republicans, each election, hire lawyers and so on to challenge these petitions. And the third-party candidate needs to, of course, hire